Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining today's office hours. My name is Joel Coleman. I'm on the Apex product development team, and I hope everyone's having a good summer or winter if you're in the Southern Hemisphere. Today's topic is Oracle Apex and Multitenant from Jason Straub. Today's session is being recorded and it will be made available later online. Please remember to keep your video and audio turned off, and if you have any questions, please feel free to enter that in the chat. We'll address these questions in chat, and we'll save some questions for Jason towards the end of this session. And with that, over to you, please, Jason.
Sure. Thank you, Joel. This is, as Joel mentioned, Oracle Apex and Oracle Multitenant. What you need to know. My name is Jason Straub, and I work in the database cloud and developer tools integrations team. I joined Oracle back in 2000, so I'm an early Apex team member. I worked on things such as legacy web service support. So the web service support in earlier versions of Application Express prior to the really nice declarative stuff in Application Express 18.1. But I also work on Oracle database cloud offerings as well. I work on Application Express there, did some work on the schema service as well as the Exadata Express, and I'm also working on a version of the Oracle Cloud that will include Application Express here, hopefully in the very near future. I also worked on Application Express in the new multi-tenant architecture for the Oracle database, and what it means for Application Express to be able to work well in a multi-tenant environment and also exploit the new features of multi-tenant, and that's what we're going to talk about today. I can be reached on Twitter at Jason A. Straub, and I also have a blog here at Blogspot where I have some of the tips and tricks that I'm going to show today. I've actually blogged about, so you can go back there for reference. Pretty much everything I'm going to show today is in base product, and it is already released product. I may refer to futures, and if so, please don't make any purchasing decisions based on that. So what we want to cover today, this really is, I guess, a presentation in two parts. The first part is just an introduction to what the database feature called Oracle Multitenant is, just give a brief introduction of that. Then talk about Application Express in that multi-tenant architecture, both from where we started and what we currently recommend. And then we'll look at some tips and tricks that we found, from using this architecture for close to 6 years now. And I'll do some demos based on those tips and tricks. The second half, I want to talk about this new multi-tenant feature called Application Containers, and we'll go into how Application Express can exploit the Application Containers feature. New in 19.1, we can install Apex in an application container. Then we'll do some application container demos, both what it means for building your own applications and utilizing the application container model, as well as what it means for Apex to be installed in application containers. And then we will finish up with some question and answer. So let's start with what multi-tenant architecture is. So before that, let's talk about the traditional Oracle database architecture, probably from 1979 or before, all the way up into 2013. And that is for each database that you created on a piece of hardware, each database would require its own memory, processes, and data files. So as you add databases, you would start consuming these resources on the system, and quickly, as you add more databases, you would pretty much consume all of your resources on that system. So starting in 2013, originally announced, I believe, at Oracle Open World in 2012, was this new multi-tenant architecture of the database, where memory and processes are only at something called the container level. And this set of processes and memory is shared by something called pluggable databases. So when you utilize this architecture, you can plug in many of these pluggable databases and use less system resources, allowing you to add more databases. So just some terminologies, the components of the multi-tenant architecture. We have these pluggable databases, as I mentioned, which plug into the container database, or the multi-tenant container database. And to shorten that up, we can call pluggable databases PDBs, the multi-tenant container database root, and together they are the CDB. And in some architectures, you can have up to 4,000 of these PDBs per CDB. So what are some of the advantages of using this architecture? So you can have your applications run self-contained in PDBs, and these applications run unchanged. From the standpoint of the application, a PDB is just a traditional database. There's no changes whatsoever. There's also a way to clone these PDBs very quickly, so you can do rapid provisioning, and we're actually going to demo that a little bit later. But as far as the DBA is concerned, these common operations are done at the CDB level. So you're not managing each pluggable database separately as a separate database. You manage common tasks such as upgrade, high availability, and backup at the container level. But you can get granular when that's appropriate. For example, if you're using Resource Manager, you can lock that down per PDB basis. And then because you're sharing the memory and background processes with the CDB for all of the pluggable databases, you can fit more databases per server or more applications per server, if you will. A little bit about users in this architecture. So users that are local to a PDB can be thought of as just regular users prior to this architecture. But there's also this special class of users in this architecture called common users. They have the same identity to all PDBs, and they can log into any PDB as long as they have the create session privilege for that. Common users actually own the Oracle system as well. So sys, system, and Oracle supplied users are common users. And these common users, obviously sys and system, can administer PDBs as well. So just quickly, some use cases for using multi-tenant development and testing. I mentioned fast provisioning and cloning, enterprise consolidation, because you can fit many more databases per one CDB, and software as a service lends itself well to this architecture, and I'm going to show you that in an example later, how that is possible. So let's talk about Apex in Oracle Multitenant. So the standard default installation in 12.1, when the multi-tenant feature was first introduced, was to have Application Express installed common, so the Apex user was a common user. If you think back to that user slide that I had. And then each PDB contained metadata links back to the application root in CDB $root. So your PL/SQL packages and all that were just really pointers back to the root. But each PDB also had its own Apex schema, which had tables that held local data. So in that respect, each PDB was its own unique instance of Application Express. So Application Express was also in something called PDB$seed, which is used when you create a new PDB. And so therefore, when you created a new PDB, it would already contain Application Express. So it would be a new Application Express instance, and all you would have to do is configure a web listener to connect to that PDB, and you'd have a brand new version of Application Express. We also allowed you to remove the common Application Express from a CDB by running this removal script. And it originally started at apx_remove_con.sql, but then we consolidated these scripts so that you run the same script whether you're connected to CDB$root or a local database or PDB. So what that would do is remove Application Express from everywhere. And so if you were going to do this, you need to make sure that you weren't using Application Express in any of the PDBs. But one of the advantages of uninstalling Application Express from the CDB at that time was that you could connect to a PDB and run our installation scripts and install different versions of Application Express in these PDBs. Or you can even install a mix of development environments or runtime only environments. We also provided you a script to take the default full development environment that was installed common and then convert that to a runtime for the CDB if you wished. So looking at the two different models of Application Express, where Application Express is installed common in the root, and then where Application Express is installed locally in the PDBs, upgrading and patching is a little bit different. So when it's installed common, you would just connect to the CDB and run a single script, apexins.sql, for example, if you were doing an upgrade. But where Application Express is installed locally in PDBs, then you would connect to each PDB separately and then run that script to do that again. So since version 5.0 in our documentation, we have been recommending that Apex should not be installed in CDB$root. And we made this recommendation based on our own experience of a large system where we had Application Express instances installed, and not all of the PDBs actually needed to use Application Express. And what we found is that when Application Express is installed common, when you needed to upgrade Application Express, even the PDBs that had no interest in Application Express at all had to be brought down during this upgrade. So that was one of the reasons why we recommended not installing it common in the root. And that way you can manage each version in each PDB independently, and you only need to bring down the PDB that's being upgraded while the other PDBs can remain available and online. So some more of the considerations when Apex is installed common is that plugging and unplugging becomes severely limited when Application Express is installed common. And this is because then the source CDB and the target CDB must have the same Apex installation type, so common or local. And if Apex is common in a CDB, then both the target and source CDB must be at the exact same version and the exact same patch set, or you won't be able to plug that PDB in. So that limits the portability of the PDB. As well, if you're plugging a PDB where you had Apex installed common into a CDB where Apex is installed locally in PDBs, there's really no way to do that. It's not a supported operation. So that is why starting in Oracle Database 12.2, you will find that Application Express is not installed by default at all. However, we still ship Application Express with each database release, including the latest on-premise release, Oracle Database 19c, where we have Application Express 18.2. You'll find that in the Oracle Home. Now there's a script called catconpl, and this allows you to run Oracle supplied SQL and SQL scripts in container PDBs. And when you have Application Express installed common in your CDB, you will use this script to manage your Application Express instance, so doing DBA tasks that you might have to do. This same script is used by the Application Express install scripts or patch scripts when we detect that you're connected to a CDB and you're running the installation under the hood we're calling catconpl. But you also need to use this sometimes for management tasks. For example, let's say you've upgraded from Apex 18.2 to Apex 19.1 when you had a CDB where Apex was installed common. We always recommend that you remove the prior schema once you're comfortable with the upgrade. And so the only way to do that would be to use this catconpl script. And this is an example showing you how you just run a single statement in all containers in a CDB where we're executing drop user Apex Cascade. So let's go into some tips and tricks, and then we will demonstrate some of those tips and tricks. So one of my favorites is this ORDS multi-tenant feature. And what this feature allows you to do is it allows you to address your PDBs, so your Application Express instances in those PDBs, using the URL without having to go through a configuration and point a web listener directly at each PDB. So in this example here, we could have PDB1 and PDB2, and we simply address them by using the name of the PDB after the ORDS context root. Now, in order to get this to work, first, you need to specify CDB $root during your ORDS install. So when it asks you what to connect to, you connect to CDB $root. So you provide the service name for that. And then in the ORDS configuration in defaults.xml, you simply add this line for DB service name suffix. And what's in between there, the value that you use, matches the DB domain parameter for your database. Now, this works flawlessly when you have Application Express installed common in a CDB, but there is also a way to make it work when you have Apex installed locally in PDBs. And I've blogged about this that you can look at later, but I'm going to show you a little bit how that works. So I mentioned using catconpl. One of the things you can do is you can specify this -c parameter to specify a list of PDBs to run the scripts in. So that'll say, don't run this everywhere, just run it in the named PDBs that I specify. You can also use a C, -C, to specify a list of run it everywhere except these PDBs that I mentioned. And the example here is we are running the Apex ins script against just one PDB, PDB1, and we might need to do this if we've unplugged a pluggable database and plugged it into a CDB and the versions don't match exactly. We may need to run this Apex installer against just this one CDB. So another thing that I've blogged about, and this is actually being done today on that large system that I mentioned, is the ability to convert your common Apex to local Apex. So let's say you decided that you were running common, you actually used Apex in some of these PDBs, not all of them, but now you want to convert to where you're running Application Express locally. There really is no magic bullet script. So it's kind of like a cookbook process step by step that I blogged about. But you start with identifying all the PDBs where you're actively using Apex, and then identify the workspaces that are in those PDBs. And I have the script available at my blog, where you can run a shell script that exports all the workspaces, the applications, and the artifacts, and creates a installer script. Then you would simply back up your CDB, so you could always go back to it in case something went wrong. Then you run our standard removal script that matches the version that's in the CDB to remove Apex from all the, the CDB, the PDB $seed, and all the PDBs. And then finally, you install Apex locally into each PDB and take those installer scripts and connect to those PDBs and re-import the workspaces, applications, and files. Another neat trick or tip is to, when you have Application Express installed locally in PDBs, what you can do is you can create different versions of Apex in those PDBs and make them seeds. And the way to make them seeds is to install your version of Apex in there. You could also run additional configuration steps, like configuring it for REST access using Apex REST config. You can pre-create one or more workspaces and applications in there. You can also configure networking, so you can access remote resources. You can also configure your mail, your wallet, if you need to interact with HTTPS resources and a proxy. Then you open that PDB in read-only mode, and then when you create new pluggable databases, you could simply create it from those seeds. So let's start exploring some of those tips and tricks. So on my machine locally here, in a VM, I have 2 CDBs installed. I have Apache Tomcat, and I have actually 2 versions of ORDS installed. 2 of the same versions. I mean, I have 2 instances of ORDS, ORDS 1 and ORDS 2. And because I have 2 CDBs, I have ORDS 1 pointing to the first CDB and ORDS 2 pointing to the second CDB. Now, if I look at defaults.xml, you will see that I have that DB service name suffix. It just so happens that my CDBs, I did not specify a DB domain, so I've left this blank. And if we look at the web apps directory of my Apache, you'll see I have ords.or and apex.or. So what this means is I have one context root of ords pointing to one CDB and another context root of apex pointing to the other. So let's take a look at what's in these CDBs. So let me connect to the first CDB, and its service name is just ORCL CDB. And I can run a query against a view called CDB registry, and I could find out where I have Apex installed in here. So let's look at that query for a second. So here I'm just querying CDB registry, and I'm getting the version out, the status, the schema, and the container name and the container ID. So if I run this in my first CDB, you'll see that I have in this CDB, Application Express is installed common. So you see that it's in CDB $root. It is in PDB $seed, a PDB called Apex1, and a PDB called Apex2. I'm going to connect to the next CDB, run that same query, and you'll see something a little bit different. I don't have Application Express in CDB root or PDB seed, therefore it's not installed common, so this would imply a local installation. And I have two PDBs with this version 18.2 in them, Apex 3 and Apex 18.2 seed, really. So I have this seed database that I created, and then I created Apex 3 from it. So that was the one tip that I mentioned about creating seeds with different versions. So now I know the names of these CDBs, or these PDBs, I'm sorry, that contain Application Express. Let me go to a browser and let me open up these Application Express instances. So if I look in the URL, you'll see that I have this instance here. I have the ORDS context root, and I have Apex 1, the name of my PDB. And I can log into Apex 1 and take a look around here. I'll log into internal administration and go to manage workspaces and look at existing workspaces. And you'll see I have a couple of workspaces in here, finance and HR. Let's go to another tab. And you'll see here in the URL, I have Apex 2. So I'm referencing that other PDB. I can log into this instance. And I can do the same thing. I'll go ahead and check out what workspaces I have in this instance. And you'll see I have this project workspace. So now, in the other CDB, remember we had that Apex installed locally, and it was Apex 3. I should be able to address that within the URL as well. The only difference I'll point out here is, remember I said I had the ords.war and the apex.war because I have different instances of ords accessing the different CDBs. So every time I want to access something in the second CDB, I use the Apex context root, and then I simply use the name of the PDB here. Now let me try something else. Let's go and let's try Apex 4. Well, that worked too, which seems odd because we didn't see that in the list. When we queried CDB registry, we didn't see an Apex 4 anywhere. Let me try Apex 5, see if that works. And there's Apex 5, and sure enough, it does come back. So you might be thinking that, well, maybe I just have some trick set up here where I can type in any name that I like. And it'll bring up Application Express. Well, that's not the case. So if you see, I typed in office hours here, it said 404. And indeed, I don't have a PDB called office hours. Now, as far as that fast provisioning from a seed, and one of my tips, I can quickly change that. So I can just say create pluggable database office hours from Apex, oops. Sorry about that. Yep.
Yeah, I think you stopped sharing.
Yep, I hit the wrong button here. Are we all good now? Sorry for the disruption there.
It's all good.
Okay, good. Thank you. Oh, so if I stop sharing at this point, the point was I entered office hours in the URL here, and indeed I got a 404 not found because that PDB doesn't exist. But I'm going to create that PDB named office hours from this Apex 182 seed in my second CDB that I'm addressing using the Apex context root. And in just a matter of a few seconds, and it would even be less if I wasn't running Zoom. So there it is. My pluggable database was created, and then I just open it. So now the pluggable database will be open. And in less than 20 seconds, probably closer to 10, if I go back and I address office hours now, I will have an Application Express instance. And this was created from that seed that I created. So I know that I've pre-created a workspace in here. So I'm just going to go ahead and connect to that workspace. But some of the other things that I did was I configured network access as well. And I also configured a wallet in the instance setting. So I'm ready to go right away to use Apex Web Service and interact with an HTTPS resource. You would think. Let me try one more time. Oh, a neat feature of the SQL commands in Application Express is it will only run what you have highlighted. And so HTTPS is not really a SQL statement. So if I run this now, I will indeed get back, it looks like something from Google. So I was able to provision a brand new instance of Application Express in seconds and have that application or have that instance fully configured. Okay, one last thing that I wanted to show in the tips and tricks section here is if we look back at my first CDB where I had Application Express installed common, and one of my tips was, hey, go check out my blog because there's a way that you can convert this to common or from common to local. The first two steps is identifying all your PDBs that have Application Express in them, and then identifying the workspaces that are in there so you know which ones you need to export. We can use this magic SQL statement here where we're querying Apex workspaces, but we're going to do it from CDB $root using this containers clause. And what that containers clause allows you to do is query all the containers in the that are attached in the CDB and get an aggregate set of results back. So I can use this containers clause on this Apex workspaces view, and this will allow me to identify here everything that I'm going to need to export. So I'm going to need to connect to Apex 1 PDB and export the HR and the finance workspace, and then I'm going to need to connect to the Apex 2 PDB, and then I'm going to need to export the project workspace. So we're not going to go through the rest of the steps because we would be here the rest of the day. So we're just going to move on to talking about application containers now, the second part of this presentation. So an application container is simply an optional PDB component, or CDB component, I'm sorry, that stores data and metadata for one or more application back ends. So kind of that software as a service model. Consists of an application root PDB, which is where you would store your applications. And you simply create it like that create pluggable database command that I did earlier. You would just use the as application container clause. Then application PDBs that are created off that application root can then sync with applications that are installed in the root. And you can create application seeds and pre-sync some of these applications so that when you create new application PDBs, it'll have those applications pre-installed. So a little bit of an overview of application containers. A good example is, a store that sells something, in this case, malts, and they've decided, they have an application that they use to manage their business. They've decided that they want a franchise. So to make use of this architecture, first, they can create a pluggable database as an application container, and then install their master definition of their application in the application root. Then they can create a seed and pre-sync that application with that. And then finally, whenever there's a new franchise, like in Tulsa or Tahoe or New York, they can provision from that seed and the application will be pre-seeded in there. But what happens when you need to make a change to that application and you want to upgrade it? So in this model, all you do is you run your upgrade in application root. So you can alter your table, you can change some packages, you can update some data. And then application PDBs, including the seed, can simply sync with the root to get the new version. But they don't have to all do it at once. They could do it at a time of their choosing. So New York City, for example, can wait and decide it's not ready for the new application and then do it at a different time. Now, another nice thing about installing in the application container model is you can do that cross-container aggregation that I did from $CDB root within the application root. And that way you can get a picture of everything that is in all of your tenants. So in the old way, you would have to connect to each of these PDBs and run a SQL statement and maybe plug it into a spreadsheet. And it's cumbersome to execute that and aggregate that. But if you use this container clause like we did on Apex Workspaces, then you can aggregate for everything that's connected to that application root. So some of the advantages is that you can create the software as a service model and provide isolation between your franchises. You can set up new franchises very quickly because you just clone from the seed, kind of like what we did earlier. And you can, since you're using the multi-tenant architecture, you can support many franchises on a smaller server footprint. And then you can manage these franchises collectively on DBA tasks at the CDB level. Additionally, you have centralized application administration because you saw in this example where we just installed the update in the application root, and then this PDB is simply synced, and as well you have that aggregation I mentioned. So brand new for Application Express 19.1 is that it can as well be installed in an application container, and this is fully documented in the multi-tenant chapter of our installation guide. And you simply create a pluggable database as application container, and then you run this new script, installer script, which takes the same arguments as Apex in. It's called apxappcon.sql in that application container. Then once you've done that, you can create an application seed and sync the Apex application from the root. And then you can create any number of application PDBs with Apex pre-installed from that seed. Now, one thing to mention is that application containers have their own registry called DBA applications. So you won't see them in DBA registry or CDB registry, what we were querying before. And as well, the advantage of installing Application Express in an application container is that when future versions of Apex come out, ideally you'll be able to just run that once in application root, and then your application PDBs can run without interruption, and they can uptake the newer version or patched version whenever they decide to sync it, while the other ones can still run unchanged using the older version. So let's demonstrate some of this with the application container architecture. So the first thing I will show is, all right, let me connect back to CDB2. I'm going to run this query against CDB applications instead of DBA registry. And that's going to pull up these other PDBs. So I have Apex App Root 1. I've created a seed off that. And then I have Apex 4 and Apex 5. So that is why earlier in the demo, when I addressed Apex 4 and Apex 5 in the URL, it just worked. Now I want to show how you can take advantage of application containers for your own Apex applications. So let me go back to Apex 1. And I have an application in this HR workspace. Let's try again. Let me get a new instance here. That's better. So you'll see I have this application called Employees. Let me run it. It's a very simple application. And it's really just an interactive report on the emp table. So the idea is, this is in my CDB, the first CDB, where I have Application Express installed common. I want to take this application, package it up, and then I want to install it as an application or in an application container in my second CDB where I have Apex installed as an application container. So what I would do, I would export this. I would, get the DDL and the DML, and I'd create an installer script like this one. And the first thing I would do is I would assume I was connected to my application root, and then I would just say this alter pluggable database command, application employees. So I'm naming an application employees and I'm doing a begin install. Then everything that I do after this, I create this HR user, connect to it. I create a sequence in here. I create a table, and I'm specifying sharing equals extended data. And that is a feature of application containers that I'm going to demonstrate later. But what it basically means is when your table has sharing equals extended data, it means that some of the data can be read from root, but as well, some of the data could still be local to the PDB. Then this script is just inserting into that table. It's creating an index and a trigger. And here's where it gets neat. I also use this Apex instance admin to add a workspace. So I'm going to create an HR workspace, and then I'm going to create a user in that. HR workspace. And then I'm going to run that employees app, which was my export. And then I simply say end install. So let me run that in my Apex app root 1. So let me run that employee script. And you'll see it's doing its thing, running through there, creating table, inserting rows, running the application express export. So now I have this employees application available in my application root. So I can go to one of the application PDBs and I can simply sync this PDB with that employee's application. So I say alter pluggable database application employees sync. And what that's going to really do is replay everything that was in my script between that begin application install and end application install, which means I should be able to open a tab here, go to my Apex 4 PDB, now log into that new workspace. And run the application. So I sign in, and sure enough, I have that application there. But if I go to application 5, or PDB Apex 5, and I try the same thing, I can't log in yet. But I can easily fix that by going to that PDB and then running that same alter pluggable database statement to sync with that application. And now I should be able to log in. And again, run the application. So there we have it. Now, let's say we've decided that we're going globally as a company. And so we need to start tracking the countries of our employees. So we want to change this application a bit. We're going to want to add a country column. We're going to default that to a value, and then we're going to change this application so that it displays that country column. So I've done that already in the development instance of this and created a script to do that. So let's look at that script. And here, now all we're doing, we would connect to that Apex app root 1, and we would say alter pluggable database application employees, we say begin patch. Then we can alter our table, we can set a default value there, and then we can run the new version of the application and end the patch. So let's do that. So I go back to my application root, and let's run employees patch. Now, let's go to one of my application PDBs, let's say 5, for example, and I'll say alter pluggable database, application employees, sync. So now I have synced those changes from root. If we go back to employees application in Apex 5 and run this, I need to log in again because I didn't preserve my sessions when I created the new application. And you'll see, indeed, I do have country in here. However, if I go back to Apex 4 and I run this application here, the application is as it was before, running unchanged. So I can pick up the version of the patch whenever I want, or I could just run the old version. So that's a pretty powerful thing, I think, that you can do with your own Application Express applications utilizing this application container model. One more thing I want to show about this model is, remember, I mentioned that I created that table and I defined it as sharing equals extended data. So one of the things I can do is I can go back to my app root and insert a row for JSON. So let's do that. So we inserted it into the app root, and here we are at Apex 4, and JSON does show. Let's go to the Apex 5 PDB and refresh the report, and JSON shows there. Now the second part of that demo is to connect directly to a PDB, application PDB, Apex 5, and let's insert a row for Luke. Commit that change. Here we are at 5 already, and you will see Luke down there. Let's go to 4 and run this, and Luke is not available, just JSON is. So that is how you make use of the extended data feature of tables in application containers. Now, finally, I wanted to point out, well, what does this mean for Application Express itself installed as an application container or in an application container? And let me just show an example of this. So let's say I go to my employees, again, application in Apex 4 here. I go to the home page, and let's say I decide as a developer, I want to make a change to this application because I don't want people to hide the e-name column, because the report wouldn't make sense without this e-name column. So I can just highlight e-name. I can go down here where it says enable users to, and I could say no to hide. So let me save and run this. And let's go to e-name. Let's go to job first. And you see I can hide that. E-name, you see I can't hide it. So that's so far so good. But what if I was crafty and I said, let me go to the columns. I know I can do this. And let me say do not display. And I click apply. Sure enough, the e-name column is gone. So let's say I think that is a bug. So I do some searching online and I figure out, indeed, it is a bug. And it's listed here in this Application Express 19.1 patch set exception bundle. And so theoretically, this patch set exception will fix this issue. So what I would do then is I would download this patch set exception bundle, and let's go to where I have this downloaded. And you'll see this new, typically we have cat patch and we have cat patch con for container databases. There's a new in the PSE bundle, a new installer script called cat patch appcon. And that's simply the script that you run when you have Application Express installed in an application container. So let me connect back to that CDB where I have Application Express in an application container. And as I say, just alter session set container equal Apex app root 1. And the point about this is I am going to run this cat patch PSE bundle against my application container without shutting down access to either one of my Apex 4 or Apex 5 PDBs. I'm just running it against the app root, which no one is connected to. So I could do this hot. So now I'm applying the patch set to the application root. And to simply uptake the patch set exception into one of my application PDBs, I simply connect to one of those. Now in this case, if I was applying the PSC to an application PDB that people are actively connecting to, I would normally shut down, web services to it, or the web listener to it. But in this case, I'm going to roll the dice for the interest of time. And I am going to say alter pluggable database application. This time it's Apex sync. And it will replay everything from the patch set exception that I ran in application root into Apex 5. While Apex 4, we can still have, web listener access to it, and it'll run unchanged and be unaffected by this. So let's go back to make sure we're on Apex 5. We are. Let's do that same change here in Apex 5, where we edit the column and not allow it to be hidden. I apologize, this takes slightly longer to run while I'm in the Zoom. It was much snappier when I wasn't Zooming. So let's go to columns, ename. Again, back down here, enable users to hide no. Let's save and run that change in Apex 5, who I applied the patch set to. I go to ename, and I don't see the ability to hide. I go to columns. Let's remove ename and put it in the do not display list. Click apply, and you'll see ename is still displayed. So that was the last demo, and I just wanted to show why it will make sense to install Application Express in an application container where you can apply patch sets in centrally manage one spot, the application root, and then have your application PDBs uptake those changes whenever they are ready for them. So with that, let's go to question and answers.
Okay, thanks, Jason. Just a couple here. Although this was already addressed in the chat, I'll ask it again.
Okay.
What happens if you try to sync and you have an existing app ID in the PDB, but let's say it's a different application altogether? Oh, I should point out this is from our friend Sunny. Will it overwrite the existing app in the PDB when you do the sync?
When you do the sync, yes, because it's just running it's replaying all that DDL. So if you have the ability to overwrite your applications in your own workspace, it can overwrite it.
Okay. Another question is, can there be more than one application root? That is, could you have multiple application roots correspond to effectively different versions of Apex?
Yes, that's a great question, and I should have pointed that out. That is exactly true. Now, it doesn't make sense right now because Application Express 19.1 is the only version that you can run. Well, I guess theoretically you could run 19.1 with that patch set that I just applied in different application roots. But yes, you can have multiple application roots, and then you could have different versions of Application Express. So for example, when we come out with 19.2, you can have a 19.1 root and a 19.2 root.
Okay. It's all right, but I know we're just a couple minutes over. Just a couple more questions. When you sync from an application root, and let's say you're syncing Apex, does that require downtime in the target PDB? So for example, you applied that patch set bundle. Would there have to be downtime in the PDB as you're doing that sync?
When you're doing the sync in the PDB, but only when you're doing that sync, right? So that was tried to make the point that you can run it against application root, no downtime. In my example, I just ran it hot. If we had more time, I should have, gone through the steps to shut down the listener and things like that, then did the sync and then brought everything back up. But that would be the proper way to do it, just as if you were applying the PSC to a local database or a local Application Express instance.
Sure. Okay. And last question, if there are any issues syncing, where is that information logged? Where can you see errors? And is that sync restartable?
It is not restartable. It is logged in DBA application errors, I believe. And so what you would have to do is craft a patch that, does complete successfully. So
okay, so Matthias just asked this in the chat as well. I think we were asking the same question. So what happens if you get a sync error in a PDB which didn't occur during the update in the root app? You're saying that you can't restart that and you would effectively have to manually fix the PDB where this failed.
Right. And then run it again.
Yeah. Okay. I think that's all we have.
Great.
Thanks everyone for joining today, and thanks Jason. I thought this was an excellent presentation on this topic. This recording will be made available online shortly, and we hope to see everyone at the next Apex Office Hours session in mid-July. Thanks everyone. We wish you a great day.
Thanks.